CNBC senior international correspondent and anchor in Abu Dhabi and here in Dubai as well. Welcome. It's great to have all of you and our amazing group of panelists on this stage. We're going to be talking about the pandemic's legacy on corporates, on firms, on workers in the Middle East and North Africa, and hopefully looking at some solutions as we move into that post-pandemic narrative. I'd like to introduce our panelists. His Excellency Abdullah bin Tuq Al-Mari. He is the UAE's Minister of Economy and a cabinet member as well. Also, Jihad Azor joining us from Washington, Director for the Middle East and Central Asia at the IMF. We're also joined by Ronaldo Mouchouer. He's, of course, Vice President, and I've interviewed this man a couple of times, Amazon MENA, and CEO and co-founder of Souq.com. So a major success story for Dubai and for the UAE. It's great to have him on the program, as well as Raghib Assad. Of course, he's the professor at the University of Minnesota. He's a research fellow as well at the Economic Research Forum. Gentlemen, welcome to the panel. And audience, welcome as well. So when we think about this a little bit more broadly, just in the last couple of days in this post-pandemic narrative, some of the things that we've been talking about on CNBC, of course, are the global energy crisis, higher oil prices, higher gas prices, rising inflation, the latest CPI numbers out of the United States, a lot of concern, of course, about economies overheating, and worry, of course, about whether or not the Fed in the United States is doing enough and acting quickly enough. We've got the US dollar today at 16-month highs. All of that playing into a broader narrative of what happens right here in the MENA region. I've had a bird's eye view on the success story of the UAE over the last decade plus based here. So I'm very excited that we have His Excellency here to kind of walk us through the measures that the UAE took very, very quickly at the onset of the pandemic, what we can learn from them and what potentially we can build on. But I want to ask Jihad to just weigh in to begin with and just walk us through your latest report, something that we did an interview on a couple of days ago, in terms of the major points that we need to think about.
Well, thank you very much, Hadley, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And it's also a pleasure to be doing this again in person over the last at least 3 or 4 months. Well, where do we stand? The recovery is there. And the recovery is driven mainly by 2 factors: accelerating vaccination that has countries who have been on the forefront of dealing with health issues to recover fast. The second thing, the result of the policy set was institution. Save life, address life work issues, and start the recovery is painful. Since the beginning of the year, we've seen recovery. Yes, it's an uneven. Countries are able to accelerate faster than others, and then we can discuss that. But also, it's not only uneven in terms of different vaccination, but also different capacity. The second issue that we are in an uncertain moment. You rightly mentioned. Okay. Thank you. You rightly mentioned the issue of inflation. I think inflation is worldwide risk today, although we expect that inflation, after peaking this year, will gradually recede in the years to come. Therefore, uncertainty around inflation, and the issue with inflation is it was mainly driven by food issues. The second uncertainty is about how this global recovery will shape up, especially with the risks of new outbreaks of COVID. And here globally, it's very important to accelerate vaccination in order to reduce risks and reduce divides. But also, are we going to see a faster than expected normalization of monetary policies that could affect emerging economies? If we zoom into the region, GCC is performing this year better than the other parts of the region, and it's mainly driven by non-oil sector. I think everybody is expecting that the increase in oil has led to the growth this year. No, what drove the growth and the recovery this year is the non-oil sector. And this is thanks to the policies that were introduced in 2020 to fight the pandemic and to protect lives, and then to accelerate vaccination. What also we see that emerging economies are gradually recovering, and yet here the issue is debt has increased and vaccination is divergent. between countries. Three, that we see this year that this crisis had led to a certain number of scarring. And I think this is also one of the issues that we are discussing today. Corporate sector has been affected. And here, small and medium-sized enterprises were affected more. And the question, are sectors or were sector affected the same way? No. Technology has been performing better. And this is also an important element for rebuilding the future. If everyone is affected the same, and also here the answer is no. Women and youth were more affected by the crisis than the rest. And the capacity of the recovery to bring growth back and bring jobs back is uneven. And there are certain fault lines that we need to work on. And therefore, the important questions that we have today is, yes, the focus should stay on saving lives, preserving livelihoods, which is the immediate issue. But we need to accelerate and deepen the recovery. And more importantly, is to have this recovery a transformative one. In 2008, we had global financial crisis that we all thought here in the region that it affected the region mildly. But we, in fact, underestimated the impact, the transformative impact of this crisis, which led to a decade of low growth, small scale of FDIs, and we were not able to, in fact, address some of the issues like debt or fiscal sustainability. Therefore, it's an important moment, and it's a transformative moment for the region and also for the various sectors that will drive the recovery. Technology is one, climate is another one, and understanding how the global value chain will affect the region is an important challenge.
I just want to take a second and welcome our other panelists who's joined us remotely. Ruba Jawdat, it's great to have you as well joining us. Your Excellency, I want to pick up with you though. When you think about this a bit more broadly, just within the context of the non-oil sector specifically, and the ability of the UAE, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and the other Emirates to pull themselves out of this pandemic and turn this into a success story. You can't drive up and down that very, very busy Sheikh Zayed Road right now. I don't know if you guys have been making that trek, but I make it twice a day, and not believe that the UAE had a head start on all of this. Walk us through the narrative with regards to the strategy and where we're going to go from here. Maybe.
Right. I think the good thing is, Hadley, is that I've overseen the whole narrative when it started and where we are today. And I think the time when COVID-19 hit us back then, it was about in March, 18th of March, where we decided to go on a lockdown and especially here in Dubai and really take very extreme measures. At that time, I was a cabinet secretary for the UAE cabinet. And I think at that time, we decided to as well take the cabinet virtual. The amount of time that we have responded and became more agile, and at the time when it came to the Ministry of Economy, it took about 3 to 4 months, and then led the economy through the COVID-19. I've seen most of what issues are really seen on the ground, especially to corporations. And one thing, when we sat with companies, they said, we want transparency from governments. And I said, what do you mean by transparency for governments? They say, we want to know what decisions you're going to take next month. Especially in a pandemic, when decisions are going so fast, is good. But the corporations has to build as well their ability, their resilience to adapt to the changes that's going to happen next month. And that's what we've seen. And by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed came in and said his famous slogan, "La tshillu al-ham," do not worry. And I think that's something which was very vital for everybody and sustained a kind of a sustainable and stable approach in the corporations world. But I think what really delivered is, I think the data of testing, the data of people who contracted the COVID, and then the data who recovered, and as well the data of those nowadays we see who got vaccinated. Those information is very vital. And transparency, we learned in government, not to surprise corporations. And I always say previously that we've never been an expert in pandemics, but one thing nowadays in pandemic is how do you resolve these data? And I remember at that time, we had a media briefing every week. The government of the UAE never had media briefing that much every single week, where you actually brief the media and take the questions and being very transparent to the corporation and to the corporate world. This is something which is a lesson learned and gave a lot of stability to the corporate world, to the business people, to the globe as well, to see the UAE as a place where cooperation is actually functioning. We've seen days where restaurant tables were 1.5 meters apart, and then we saw 2 meters apart, and then we measured 3 meters apart, and then they went back. And this is where we understand the agility and the ability of actually the government to say, all right, we need to give more social distance. So to the level of the spaces between tables and restaurants, to the level of measuring people and testing people and testing PCR, I think that's the ability of the government. And to come out and say, we are away from COVID-19, announcement that came back in September a couple of months ago from Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed was an amazing announcement as well, that gives as well more of a stability in the region and corporate aspect. And when you see these kind of numbers that comes out, this kind of stability that comes out, you're going to see a lot of increase in commercial license, for instance. We've seen beyond 2019 numbers at the moment, 40% increase than 2019 in commercial license. We see employment rate going to 160,000 visa application happens to be in monthly now, higher than 2019. We've seen a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of traffic happening, which is good from my perspective, because the economy is getting back. People are going back to work, and you get to see the economy is going back. And this is the resilience that the trust, the hidden trust that has been built between corporates and the government, when transparency was very vital and information was given on the spot of what's happening. So there's no surprises, and allow them to actually take their own decisions based on things that has going to change. And this is something that we have learned very well from the pandemic.
In terms of that transparency, how likely is it, in your view, that we could potentially see another lockdown between Abu Dhabi and Dubai? Because certainly corporates would want to know that, workers would want to know that, and that would potentially have an impact on the labor force, obviously.
Of course, and I think it's important to really measure, not just this pandemic, what happened in the future pandemics, what happens in the next couple of years if another pandemic hits. The lesson learned, and I think it's important to keep this communication very well and very assertive, and continue communicating with the corporate world. If there is a lockdown is going to happen, you need to understand how do you amend and be very agile. You need to amend your systems. You need to know how to bring people to work and back to work from home, and these kind of setups. Because in the end of the day, what really matters is the human health bar that really is a threshold for any economy, and to make sure that everybody is safe and there's no worries about any health issues. And these are the highest priorities for the UAE's government.
So the UAE government doesn't rule out the possibility
of
another lockdown?
Well, in the UAE, we are a very agile government. We are adaptive to things. We measure, we see, we take decisions based on the numbers and data of what really we see on the ground. So we are very open, and we move very fast as well.
Ronaldo, I want to bring you in terms of the tech space. Obviously, we talked a little backstage about how we've seen the tech sector more globally rebounding and doing incredibly well during this pandemic by comparison to other industries and sectors. I'm going to share some microphones. But when you think about it with regards to the main challenges for the digital infrastructure, where do we go from here?
I mean, first of all, I think two things. We always looked at the crisis, and my personal view on it was, can we exit the crisis in a better place than we went in, so we're prepared if something like this happens again? And then obviously safety and making sure everything we do is under that safety umbrella. What I have seen happen, at least in the region, is most companies have accelerated their digital journey by 3 to 4 years ahead. So even the smaller organization or companies that had maybe a huge non-tech component in their business were forced into accelerating their core component investments. And I think by doing that, they're going to be better organizations going forward. The companies or organizations that had good use of technology in payments, and the countries, by the way, also in supply chain, how digitizes your supply chain, how you're using computing and machine learning and cloud computing into the decision making, to His Excellency's point, fared a lot better because they were able to deploy these tools to solve some of the challenges that they faced in the pandemic. In our case, for e-commerce, obviously, we use these tools to get paid and get our merchant paid. We managed to manage our supply chain with all the challenges that it faced and some of the changes that were happening on the ground. But because you're using technology, you're able to scale your offering. And then the last was using machine learning to prioritize what kind of goods we should ship, when should we ship them, where do we store them, to make sure as the pattern of consumption is changing based on the pandemic, we were supplying the right goods to the right customer, we think within an ample time. So obviously this has taught us a lot, and we as an organization would be better off. What's interesting here in the region also, the influx of now investments that we see in the ecosystem of technology. So even smaller companies today are getting well funded. So you see a transformation where many of the sovereign funds, real estate organizations have started massively adopting, investing in tech versus the traditional investments. So I think the region is obviously going to be better off. But to Dr. Jihad's point also, you do have some countries where they didn't have the infrastructure. They were not ready with the digital payment. We talked about like remote employment. You want to employ someone in a village, but the infrastructure of connectivity is not there. So you're not going to be able to deploy that technology to support that community. So obviously it varied. The UAE fared very well, and the cooperation during the pandemic, I think, between the public and private sector was unprecedented. I was many times summoned to calls, and I was on calls trying to feed information, learn the decisions, feed into the decision, ask for changes to make sure that we as an organization continue to support the community and the merchants and the businesses that were depending on our technology basically to serve their own customers.
UAE often is the shining city on the hill for many reasons, one of which obviously is this communication between the government and the private sector, particularly with regards to technology. We talked a little bit about this backstage. When you think about this with regards to the broader economy in terms of the labor force, what are the countries in your view that are in danger of being left behind there because they don't have that infrastructure yet?
I mean, there are a variety of regions that are on a different spectrum. But if you take from my position as Amazon in MENA, over the last 3 months or so, we launched a big setup in Egypt. So we launched Amazon.Egypt, and now we have a huge back office to serve global organizations. We did the same in Jordan. We think Jordan has young talent, a lot of tech schools. Many of the regional startups started from Jordan. As I'm an ex-Maktubian, so Maktub was in Jordan. So you'd have an incubator of tech leaders that you want to build around. You have youth that's graduating with decent STEM schools. So that's another pocket of area that we're working on. Obviously, we see massive changes in Saudi Arabia today. If you really think about what's happening in Saudi Arabia, I finally got to go to Riyadh twice the last 2 weeks. And it doesn't look like the Riyadh that we used to visit pre-pandemic. So they're also investing in youth. And you see Vision 2030 is giving some result in terms of opportunities for the youth. And hence, this will create new type of jobs. There are more startups in Saudi today raising funding than probably even many other regions here, in many other countries in the region. So I do see these 3 countries are somehow, we see the opportunity in them, but the region, in the Arab world, we're 22 countries, so it's not all the same still.
For a country like Jordan that has a very educated youth, how tough is it for them to replicate what's happening in UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, from your perspective, from the tech perspective?
I don't expect everyone to replicate exactly what other countries had. We see youth, but obviously for us as an e-commerce company, the Jordanian retail economy or overall digital economy is not so large. So most of our focus would be on the bigger countries, be it India, be it Pakistan, be it here, the GCC, Egypt. But Jordan plays a huge role in terms of, as you said, the schools, the tech talent. So as we're hiring engineers all over the world, as this digital transformation is forcing us to think more engineering, more tech development, you need to tap into these pockets of maybe untapped resources, and maybe you need to spend a bit more effort and time to develop them, but then you create a good ecosystem there, an opportunity. And we see these leaders becoming, founders of other companies. So again, it's kind of like a flywheel in terms of what happens when you invest a bit in talent. If we need anything in the region, is just believe in our youth, but also invest in them. You can't just believe in them without backing them up.
Riba, I want to bring you into the conversation. I always hate this question from one woman to another, but we understand, of course, that the pandemic was particularly hard on women in terms of employment, and young women in particular across the region. That was no different. How do you see the post-pandemic world looking for women today? Are you optimistic about them, particularly here in the Middle East and North Africa, or is much needed to get them back to work?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for accommodating my participation virtually from Beirut. To answer this important question, I mean, it's not only for women, you know, it's also, I mean, the whole pandemic hit also unemployment for both youth and women. And as we know, the Arab youth have, you know, faced long-lasting structural challenges that have long impeded their participation in the labor market. Even prior to the pandemic, youth unemployment in the region at nearly 26% was 3.4 times higher than that of the adults. Like you said, the young women were especially disadvantaged, with unemployment among them more than twice that of young men. But also, I mean, unemployment is only part of the story. The large share of the region's youth was disengaged from the labor market, especially women, and also from the education system. You know, as of 2019, around 1 in 3 young Arabs were neither in employment, education, nor training. Our latest estimates show that youth who represented just 13% of the total unemployment in 2019 worldwide made up 43% of the 2020 loss in employment. And also our new monitor, COVID monitor, that is issued by the ILO, also shows that working hours in the region remain 4% short of the pre-pandemic levels, which is, you know, equivalent to around 7 million full-time jobs. This is, you know, this has been hit particularly youth and women, you know, twice as much as youth, unfortunately, in the region. And also, you know, there are, you know, some patterns that, you know, we see some efforts, but we don't think this is enough. There is a need for, you know, government policies to, you know, encourage and support women's participation, in particular in the region.
Rob, just to follow on to that, because this is something that you and I were talking about backstage a bit, in terms of that disengagement, how tough that has been to come back from at this point, because it's a global phenomenon. It's not just happening here in the Middle East.
For women disengaging. Yeah, I mean, the trends in the region prior to the COVID pandemic for women's participation were not positive. You actually had stagnant or declining labor force participation rates and employment rates for structural reasons. And then, of course, COVID made that even worse. Now, despite the fact that women in the region have some of the highest increases in educational attainment, the gap, in fact, has reversed in favor of women in the region. And despite that, these participation rates have been very persistently stagnant. And that's, in fact, referred to, it's a phenomenon that's referred to as the MENA paradox, because we're doing very well on the education side, but not so well on the employment side. And it has to do with the pattern of development that has favored real estate, construction, transport, basically non-tradable industries that are not favorable for women. They're male-dominated industries and quite inhospitable for women. There's also the pattern of retrenching the public sector, where women tend to be concentrated and prefer to be employed. So these structural patterns created a very difficult environment. And then came COVID, which was a double shock, a shock on the demand side for the labor market, which affected women and youth, but also a big shock on the supply side, with the care burden dramatically increasing and women having to stay at home to take care of children who are no longer in school or in child care services. So you got essentially this double whammy. And what we see is that in a lot of countries, the participation rate was affected more than the unemployment rate. We always focus on unemployment as being the main indicator of the health of the labor market, but in fact, it's quite misleading, because unemployment requires, in the standard definition, that somebody is actually searching actively for a job. And many women stopped searching actually for a job, so they were out of the labor force. And in fact, in Egypt, the unemployment rate fell during the pandemic, the female unemployment rate. The opposite happened in Jordan, where the unemployment rate increased. But so it's an unreliable indicator. And I think if you look at the employment rate, which is the employment to population ratio, you see clearly the downward trend very clearly. And so I think that looking forward, women, first of all, you have to have growth in the sectors that where women that are hospitable to women, and these are like the digital economy sector. Manufacturing often is much more hospitable, especially in some subsectors within manufacturing. For lesser educated women, it's agriculture, and these sectors hadn't been doing very well pre-pandemic. The second issue is women have to be safe in the public space. And safety in the public space is a huge disincentive for women to work. And of course, the tendency towards remote working is helpful to women, and being able to work from home is very helpful. And so if that continues and persists, that's going to be really positive. And then the third really big obstacle for women is the incompatibility between the reproductive roles and the productive roles. And women have a very large burden of reproductive hours that they have to spend every week. And our work has shown that irrespective of whether a woman works or not, her number of hours of care work is almost the same. And so it's a pretty, and that has to be resolved through better childcare services and better services in general that allow women to kind of shift some of that care burden to the marketplace. So I think that all of these things have to be worked on at once to create a more hospitable environment for women to come back to the economy.
You're excellent. Obviously, the UAE, we talked about this before in terms of being a test case for success stories. For women in particular, obviously, the government has made a lot of mandates about women being half of the workforce or half of the leadership council, et cetera. But when you think about this with regards to the future of employment for women, how does Dubai and the UAE more broadly lead the way, if you will, in terms of making sure that whether they be in the public sector or the private sector, women have the advantage, particularly when it comes to what sounds like an absolutely exhausting ratio of reproductive to productive hours?
I think very important to look at that, and I agree on the point that today women is highly attained in higher education more than men. We're very high supportive to that. We have amended a lot as well very recently on the laws that has women today in boards, for instance. And that's the first thing we did last year when we increased we made it very mandatory to have women on boardship of companies in the UAE, given that I chair the Emirates Security and Commodities Authority. And I think that's very important. Very recently as well, part of the 50 years project, the launch of a program called NAFIS, which has a lot of approach as well of employment into the private sector. And this it's a very aggressive, active employment program that has been launched by the UAE government for UAE nationals, especially in the private sector and more specifically, and really look at how do you engage women in areas where we're very far away from their homes to bring jobs very closer and engage them to that. But I think which is very important as well today is embracing technology and embracing as well productivity. And I think that with these two things, with going back to the Jordan and Amazon approach of thinking about how do you bring closer jobs, remotely work, I think is very vital and very important for us. And bringing that these two thinking together today, government and corporations, private sector, really think about how do you increase and improve productivity, and how do you really bring technology and digital aspects to it.
Ronaldo, just to weigh in on that one, please, because not just talking about women, but youth more broadly, in terms of what you've seen in the various countries that you've been working in, whether it be in Jordan or Egypt or here in the UAE, some of the takeaways that you might have that are important for various governments to understand as they're strategically planning to pull everyone out of this sort of post-pandemic malaise.
I think in my humble opinion, we're lacking the link between academia and the companies, like what we need in terms of job skills and what is graduating and how do you bridge the gap. We have done some work around, for example, internship programs where the ratios have to be half or more for women, for example, to join. And the success rate, once they come in as an intern, spend time within the organization, the success rate of us hiring
So better education
is much higher. So better alignment on what to educate. We have a lot of schools. We just pointed out that, the rate, this paradox of that we're graduating more and more and more. However, the job market. Also, we as companies, I think, owe it to ourselves to create an environment where the safety issue or the environment that creates some kind of equal space and more, educate our male colleagues in terms of how to actually, go by having female colleagues in areas such as the rural areas we're talking about would definitely go a long way. So it's not only educating or empowering the women, but also it's educating and working with the male colleagues to make sure they also can coexist in the work environments proper. Obviously, in big companies, this is easier to do. In smaller companies, this will require some investment and work.
Yeah. Obviously, this is a bigger issue in terms of finance. We were talking about this a little bit ago behind the scenes, just talking about how 10 years ago the tech sector was struggling. How many countries did you visit and how many times did you go for rounds of funding? A very, very different situation that we find ourselves in today, particularly post-Abraham Accords as well, which has led to a lot of excitement in the region. But Jihad, I just wanted to bring you in and ask you, when we talk about the transformation that is necessary in the next few years, what are the things that we need in terms of financing for the public and private sectors to grow?
Well, I would say, if I take the example of what has happened, this crisis was about acceleration of certain trends. We saw an example in technology. It was an acceleration based on necessity. I think now we need to accelerate based on opportunities. And for that, we need to identify what are the key drivers. I think access to finance, and this is something that we have discussed, we're still very low compared to other emerging economies in terms of access to finance, especially for startups, SMEs. We're around 5% of GDP, while the average is above 16. If we only double this, this will bring us additional growth. Access to talents. And now we need to make sure that those who will leave jobs of the past and moving to the jobs of the future, we are able to accompany them in this journey. And this requires corporations to come in, and I'm very happy to see that large international corporations are driving the trend. I also very happy to see that governments in certain countries are driving the trends. UAE, for example, had a couple of years ago the project of having 1 million programmers. And therefore, this is something, those initiatives are very important. Access to market. And this is an issue for SMEs. Give you an example. Usually when you have a crisis, the informality plays a role of a buffer. It protects. In this crisis, in fact, it did not. And therefore, we need to provide more access to market to allow companies to grow, startups to generate more jobs. And those important elements requires to adjust policies. And here, clearly, we need to invest in infrastructure, and this is a public policy issue. We need to enable the future, and this is, for example, investing in environment and in this big transformation is an accelerator, and also integrating. I think we have rediscovered that regional integration makes sense, that for a company like Amazon, the market of one country is not enough, and increasing the space of integration brought not only a bigger market, but also bigger opportunities, whereby you have resources of one country serving another country without being obliged to move from one country to another. And this is also what we learned from COVID, that if you don't cooperate with your neighbors, it's very difficult to find the pandemic. Therefore, I think it's a moment where we have all these elements, and we have challenges, of course. The key issue today is to try to say, okay, if we turn the page without assessing what we have learned, it will be a lost opportunity. And if we move very quickly to the old normal, we will miss an opportunity. Give an example. Oil prices are above 80. We saw in the past several cycles whereby pro-cyclicality dominates. This is a challenge today, I think. And in my discussion, I was in Manama for the GCC ministers meeting, ministers of finance, and clearly I see commitment for reform, to diversify economies outside oil, to diversify fiscal also, to be less dependent on oil, but also to think the future, how fiscal policy can serve economic recovery, can serve also transformations like investing in education and so. Therefore, it's an important moment today. We have scars, we can address them, we have risks that we need to mitigate them, and also we have an opportunity that we need to nurture them.
Are we going to see $100 oil in your view?
This is a question that I don't have an answer.
I ask him every time and he hates me. Your Excellency, I want to bring you in on that because there's a broader question there. We often have talked about this in the past, which is that every time that oil prices decide to go a little bit higher, both governments tend to slow down in their reforms. It just seems one can rest on their laurels. But with the uncertainty, not just of the global recovery, but also of this post-pandemic narrative that we're all talking about, how do you try to mitigate the risk, I guess is the question. Make policy plans, but at the same time, as you were saying earlier, remain extremely nimble.
I think that's a that's a lesson learned as well from the pandemic. I think what we really learned is, I remember the day His Excellency Abdullah Saleh just sitting, he's the Undersecretary for the Ministry of Economy. And I think last year in August, when I asked him the question about our service centers, I said to him, how many service centers that the Minister of Economy has? He said, we have about 8. So great. And are they working? They said, no, everybody's working from home. I said, that's perfect. Can we close them down? And he said, what? I said, can we close them down and get people to work from home? And those who doesn't have a lot of work, can we reskill them back into the economy, into the ministry? And he said, that's radical, but yes, we can try it out. He went for a week, he came back, he said, yes, we can close them all down. Today, the Ministry of Economy has 0 service centers. And we work digitally in most of our work. So what lesson learned we learned from is that what companies, governments that needs to look at is the sphere of digital transformation. How does it impact your work? And how do you increase productivity? And these are the 2 major things that really pushes the policy forward. The other part is it made us more aware of data and how transparent data is. And how do we be more evidence-based policymaker that can help politicians and policymakers comes more to the fruits of enabling the economy to go forward. So with that kind of information, with that kind of thinking, we managed to push the economy, the policies that you see today in the UAE, more agile, more diverse, more digital aware, and more productive. And I think the important to look at not just the GDP growth, but how the productivity growth into any economy, what is it doing and how can you improve that? And I think what Jihad have just mentioned about the acceleration of opportunities, it managed to accelerate, I think, COVID-19, the opportunity of productivity growth, where you look at merging the digital with physical and creating this kind of an ecosystem for both government and private sector to really look at what is the area. So if the future comes with more pandemics, I think the 2 things is how do you become more productive and how can you become more digital? And that's how I see the future going.
Ronaldo, when you think about the impact long-term of the digital space, there's been a lot of emphasis, of course, on the digital economy. A lot of people think that this is going to save us all, but it requires finance. You're in a situation right now where Larry Fink's got $7 trillion to deploy. Where is he going to put it? People are putting $1 trillion valuation on Tesla. I mean, the money's flying around all over the place. But at the end of the day, these companies and these products have to deliver. How do you see this playing out? What are the pitfalls in your view?
So, I mean, I want to take a step back. I think the key is to invest in these companies, and the SME ecosystem is going to drive, I think, the growth. It's not going to only come from the big companies. If you look at the SME sector, initially it was all about how do we make the life easy and the cost of setting up these businesses quickly. So many governments got organized around, like, the ease of doing business was kind of a benchmark that many companies when many countries went by trying to index themselves. Then came financing. Many of the region here, you have unbanked individuals. So then technology and fintech played a big role where you have tons of investments going in. But I think that's a good thing because it's allowing microfinancing, lending, it's allowing the unbanked to bank, some kind of a pay later programs for many of this. So that area is solved. I think the third one to get these SMEs to flourish is connectivity, because now it's about digital. They need to be also very digitally savvy. The governments can play a role in terms of setting up the networks and getting them connectivity. And you're going to see a sphere of B2B entrepreneurs that are going to try to solve for these SMEs in terms of supply chain, in terms of point of sales, in terms of access to some of the data system to help them run their businesses, and they will flourish. So myself, I see a lot more investments that are going to support that ecosystem. That's how we come out of it versus like bigger governments and so forth. So I would bet on the SME as the key and just enabling them with those three factors: ease of doing business, financing and microfinancing, which tech can play a big role because we have all the data and we can probably do good hedging and betting on how to finance these guys and tools. And then the third one is obviously the technology and B2B tools to help these small businesses. So that's how I think we recover out of this.
Rag, if you want to come in on this, because the question, I guess, is beyond that, which is that not everyone can be employed by the digital economy. It's not going to save everybody. So what still needs to be done, in your view, across the board, Middle East, North Africa, within the context of reforms?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are all now worried about the future of work. This term, future of work, is really coming up a lot in a lot of conversation, and everybody thinks that automation is going to go everywhere and affect everybody in similar ways. And my view on it is that we're all going to have to be more literate with the digital technology, etc. But we're not all going to be in the digital economy as such. And what you see in this, what the pandemic has done is that, in fact, it has created this bifurcation between micro and small enterprises that had some presence in the digital space, that were able to use Facebook and other digital platforms to market their products, and those who didn't. And you got a lot of creative destruction with a lot of micro firms actually closing permanently. But I'm sure there'll be others that have expanded and been able to do very well. So I think the gig economy is here and it's going to increase. And in fact, our youth are quite used to working in this kind of informal, flexible way. But the key issue here is they cannot all become entrepreneurs. So they need platforms, and they need platforms that can aggregate these services. Amazon being a good example, Uber being another example, and being able to organize these services in a way that can find the market. And so I think that our youth are able and are ready to participate in those things, but they cannot all become entrepreneurs and make it. So I do think that government policy can help by, first of all, creating the training that is necessary for people to be able to participate in the digital economy, the training and education side, create the business climate where these platforms can set up and operate, and they have to be in the region, in the country. They cannot be platforms elsewhere, because the connecting to a platform that is not in your country is much more difficult. So the fact that Amazon came and opened in Egypt is really important. So I think that there is a lot of potential in this area, but in a sense, the government has to reduce red tape and allow the region to take advantage of its comparative advantage.
We launched during the pandemic Amazon Home Services, which means a plumber, a painter, a technician, a person who can install a treadmill is able suddenly to get connected to the ecosystem of Amazon customers. He's not very digitally savvy. He just had to have a phone. But most of our region and most of our youth do have phones. So by launching the service, we really enabled them during the pandemic to almost get new demand, solve for new things. And obviously, we as a platform being local, we were managing the governance of it. We were managing the quality, the compliance with the local regulations in terms of safety, health, all the things that were going around the pandemic. So this is a good example where the workforce on the platform is not very digitized. Yes, they have to use at least a phone, but most of the processes were designed for the local markets we're in, within the local regulation, and many of them were able to operate.
Also, I think I wanted to add one dimension, which is social. Social became one of the key sectors that will help us address the crisis and grow out of the crisis. Clearly, social is at the center of what we went through over the last year and a half. Issues related to public health, issues related to education, etc. Therefore, I think one of the key lessons of the future is we need to put social at the center of our thinking for the future. And a new social compact is needed. Is needed on the supply side, improving the quality of education, the quality of medical services, but also on the organization side, reforming the labor market, improving the infrastructure in order to allow those who need the social infrastructure to work, to come to work. Women will benefit from that tremendously. And there are different estimates that if you increase or reduce the participation gap by half between men and women in the next 10 years, you can create almost $1 trillion of output in the region. Therefore, I think one of the lessons that social framework has to change, the role of the state also has to change. Because also here we saw that the role of the state that was very effective during the crisis has to change, and we need to reform how SOEs works, how public sector entities work. Otherwise, the space that the private sector needs, especially at this level where access to market is difficult, the SMEs will be totally occupied by existing players. Therefore, it's very important to address this.
I want Ruba to come in on that because one of the things that she's focused on, obviously, is the informal versus the formal labor sectors. Ronaldo was just making the very good point that the digital economy can be used to really bridge that gap, if you will. But at the same point, there are structural issues that are still a major concern for this part of the world, across the Middle East and North Africa. How do you see that trending over the next 10 years as we pull ourselves out of this global pandemic? What are some of the things that were found during the pandemic, and how do you think that those things will be evolving?
Sorry, Hadley, is that, okay, your voice is not very clear. Is that question?
So the informal?
Is that?
The informal to the formal, the informal versus the formal sectors in the labor market. What were some of the things that you found pandemic versus this post-pandemic economic transformation we're moving towards?
Okay, actually, unfortunately, the informal employment has become the norm rather than the exception in most of the Arab region, and it's representing almost 64% of the total employment in 2020, which means that nearly 2/3 of the total employment in the region lacks adequate protection. According to our latest estimate, the COVID-19 pandemic has hit these workers, exceptionally hard, with almost, 82% of them being severely impacted. This hefty impact on informal workers is due to two main reasons. First is the sectoral. A third of the 81 million informally employed workers are employed in sectors identified by the ILO as hard-hit sectors, such as food services, accommodation, wholesale and retail trade, and real estate. And therefore, they are at the great risk of losing their jobs or witnessing a decrease in their hours of work. And second, it has to do with the type of employment that is in the sector, with almost 65% of informal of the informally employed workers are own account workers or work in small firms of less than 10 workers, and therefore much more vulnerable to economic shocks. Now, what can be done to integrate them in the formal sector? You know, a successful formalization strategy requires a set of policies, and that would focus on growth strategies and quality employment generation in the formal sector, sound economic, sectoral, and trade policies that aim at creating decent and high value added jobs. In parallel, policies will need to focus on skills development and lifelong learnings, and also governments. You know, I would like to urge governments to improve the regulatory environment, especially through enforcement of legislation in line with the international labor standards and fundamental rights at work. And also, equally important is the role of social protection. Social protection is, you know, crucially important of extending coverage to all workers, including those in the informal economy. We know this is not easy, but it is important also to extend coverage to them. And also, it's important that enhancing representation and social dialogue is also needed in our region and should include representatives of the informal economy, to provide them with a platform where they could voice their needs and concerns.
Social protection in light of the informal nature of employment. The pandemic has really highlighted the need of new ways of thinking about social protection. And for many countries, for example, on the fly had to come up with social protection programs for irregular workers who are really badly affected by the pandemic. Now, had these systems of reaching or protecting informally employed and irregular workers been there, we would have had much greater success in providing that safety net. And so we need to be much more creative about how we provide social protection away from the standard model of a permanent job with social insurance coverage, etc. And with the increase in the gig economy, we need to know how are we going to protect these workers. So I think this is an institutional issue where the institutions have to adapt to catch up with the economic changes that are occurring. And there has been some successes. So the irregular worker cash transfers that happened in Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt are very good examples of that. But they need to be institutionalized, and the way of financing them, you know, they're non-contributory systems. So where is the money going to come from to support these social safety nets? And I think that's an opportunity for us to rethink social protection programs.
Can I just add into that? I think it's important to look at what we learned as well from the COVID-19. There is a cabinet decree from the team leading by the Ministry of Human Resources and Democratization, and we are part of it in the Ministry of Finance, to really look at unemployment insurance law. How do you really protect that kind of aspect as well? So there's a huge work at the moment now in the cabinet and the government as well to lead. What we learned is we need that kind of safety net for social, because it really adds up back to the economy. It's really, you need it when the economy is at the pandemic situation. So there's a lot of that kind of thinking came into the policymakers with data evidence-based policymaking, looking at these are the right way to really focus and be resilient and ready for future pandemics.
Things you hadn't necessarily thought of before that needed to be done. Jihad, just to wrap it up before we take some audience questions, just wanted to get your viewpoint on, we talked a little bit about the transformational economy and how do we get there. What are some of the key takeaways that you've had, not just from the report, but from your travels around the region? Because we see such a difference, for example, between the transformation we've seen, for example, in Saudi Arabia versus the struggles that they have, sadly, in the failed state, which is Lebanon. So.
Well, I think what we did last year, all of us, was very useful to overcome the first wave of the shock. Countries reacted very quickly by providing assistance, introducing certain number of new measures. We, for example, at the fund, we reacted very quickly with $100 billion of assistance to countries in order to allow them to react very quickly. And in the region, we provided $20 billion. This year, we are providing $45 billion through the SDRs. And this reactivity is an important lesson that we learned from this crisis. One. Second, countries are not the same. but there are issues that are similar in the region. You have high level of unemployment that across the board, that is, although the level of unemployment increased by 1.8% this year, but from a high level, and especially at the youth and women. Therefore, I think inclusion is going to be very important, and each country has to do it on its own way, using the needs of this country. Technology, for example, helped the inclusion in Morocco, providing assistance to 5 million families through mobile technology. Mobile technology also helped to remain or to keep the remittances at a high level, which is an important lifeline to many countries in the region. Therefore, those kind of breakthrough that in the past used to take 5-6 years to materialize, now we are seeing them in few weeks, few months. We need to keep this pace of transformation. 3, which is, I think it's very important for us here in the region, is we have been in the last 10 years dealing with 2 lows, 2 highs. Low growth, low productivity, high unemployment, high debt, except for countries who have buffers like in the GCC. And we need to address that. And only a combination of certain number of reforms will allow us to do so. Yet, as you rightly raised the issue, there are certain countries who are facing higher level of vulnerabilities. Lebanon, Yemen, Libya, Sudan, Somalia. We did last year 2 big operations, one for Somalia and recently for Sudan in terms of debt relief. But also we're discovering, or we know it, but I think everybody is discovering, that those transformations from fragility to normality take time. And therefore, this is where it brings me back to an important point. I think the region needs to talk together more. And this kind of gathering is very important, bringing people from different backgrounds who are partner in dealing with the issues, different people from different countries who are able to do the reforms, and having countries like UAE who became a kind of role model. The fact that UAE moved very quickly in addressing through bold measures, the issue of the COVID, from the first measures to use technology to track and trace, then accelerate vaccination even before vaccines were accredited. Those are developments that help other countries to follow suit. And I think with greater cooperation and integration, we could lift up the region, and also we could provide more opportunities to all. And this is where companies like Amazon here can play the role, because they are cross-border in nature and they don't differentiate. They go where talents are, they develop opportunities, and they try to connect. This is where I think it's very important now to use this disruptive crisis, where maybe everyone now is focused on the challenges, is how to turn them into opportunities.
Yeah. And Your Excellency, how does the UAE plan to lead the way in terms of that cross-border conversation that's so necessary for businesses to scale, breaking down those borders and barriers?
Of course, I think there's a lot of work that we have launched very recently through the Ministry of Cabinet Affairs, programs that has seen in Jordan, for instance, the government Accelerator program that we've seen that has been launched in Amman a couple of days ago. There's a lot of work that we're doing with other countries and nations, that we're taking the lead on the thinking of the UAE's government and exploring how do we implement it globally. Uzbekistan, for instance, there's a lot of programs that the government work to bring this kind of rethinking and agileness to the incentives globally. And I think there's a lead way that we can actually work with other governments to show how you can be more agile in areas of pandemics.
I'm going to open up the floor to some questions. I think that we have a microphone that we can pass around.
I can give them mine.
Bravo.
When it comes to climate resilience, when it comes to adaptation of the process, what are some of the policy challenges regions might face, particularly since the coming 2 years of very high social spending due to the pandemic, and so high oil prices are being
Well, thank you very much. This is an important question. As you know, the fund has been recently scaling up the work on climate, not only on the issues related to climate mitigation, but also to climate adaptation. And here I would like to announce that early January, we will be launching a new study on the impact of climate issues on the region. I think it's important, to assess where we are. And where we are is not great, because over the last 2 decades, we see big deterioration of climate issues. And therefore, we need to move on more than one track. Mitigation is an important dimension. Although our contribution at the region to the global emission is low, but I think there is an important dimension, which is adaptation. We need to help countries adapt to the new world and to the new challenges. And here, what the fund is trying to do, as you know, we are launching a new trust fund to help develop capacity for countries to be more resilient in financing initiatives around project in climate. But also, we are very much encouraged to see that several countries have announced ambitious programs. UAE, for example, has announced recently a very important set of initiatives to reach carbon neutrality. And also, UAE, for example, have started with Masdar a long time ago, investing in this important dimensions. You're seeing other countries doing the same. The next COP will be in the region, and also maybe, hopefully, the following one. Therefore, those are important opportunities for all of us to work. There is a role for us as an organization, as an international institution. Government have a role, private sector have a role. I think the big amount of resources will come from the private sector and will come from the financial community. And here also, during the annual meetings, we had the topic of our discussion with ministers and governors of central bank from the region, where the managing director was on this issue of climate. And we were very much encouraged to see that it's something that they are taking it seriously. And although it's a big challenge, but I feel that we have moved the needle in the region in the last 2-3 years.
As a follow-on to that, is it surprising to you that petrodollar economies like the UAE, like Kuwait, like Saudi Arabia are moving in the direction of net zero, perhaps faster than those in Russia, even those in China and elsewhere who failed to show up to the COP26?
Well, it's very interesting. Let me say 2 things on that. Countries of the GCC and mainly have started the diversification since 2014, 2015, when the oil price went down. And they understood that this is a long-term journey. And now they have augmented this strategy of diversification to increase the weight of renewable eco investment in it, which is very welcome move. Because also they see opportunities here. The world of energy will remain with us. The sources of energy will change. Now we're relying on fossil fuel. In the future, we will rely more on renewable energy. But energy is still a market in itself. I think what is important now going forward is to, again, I go back to my point, that in climate, regional approach makes sense. Because you're sharing water, you're sharing an environment. To protect it, you need to have more than one country working together. I hope that when we see a bit more clarity on the strategies of various countries, we can create a platform whereby on peer-to-peer basis, and this is something that we at the fund we will help in, is to bring all these players together in order to have the sum of the unit larger than what each country is trying to do.
Next year, of course, will be the COP27. That's going to take place in Egypt. And I believe there may be an announcement about the COP28 taking place in the UAE, if it hasn't happened already, or it may happen later today. Not to break the headline, but Your Excellency, when you think about this with regards to the job market, the labor market, and the transformation in the energy space, how many jobs do you think are going to be added to the UAE's economy by this transformation?
When we look at the transformations of the economy, we understood that in the middle of COVID-19, we launched the UAE's economy's recovery plan of the 33 initiatives. And we discussed the aspect of in phases, so phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, which phase 1 was to recover to 2019. And we are 100% completion on that. We are back to 2019 numbers. At phase 2, we're trying to now diversify a little bit of what's the economy at the moment and get it back to ignition, and that's about 50% completion. And phase 3, which we are expecting to start in 2022 onwards, is to diversify the economy towards new economies, such as a cleaner circular economy, towards renewable energy, towards space economy. And I think the launch of very recent, the Mars Hope probe that went to Mars, the other launches as well to the other parts of the universe. I think it's important to look at these type of economies will create a lot of jobs, and we are expecting about 50,000 to 100,000 jobs of creation that will happen in the next couple of years into these new types of economies. We are gearing up as well the universities and the attractions of talent, because we understand that these type of economies needs talent, both locally and both from the outside, globally as well. And I think it's important to attract that by creating our own kind of visa regime with the launch of the golden visa, the green visa, the freelance visa scheme that has been launched very recently. This shows you that the UAE is ready to adapt future technology, future economies, and attract talent, because we understood as well that the fuel for any future economy is talent. By these regimes, everything is ready and set up. The moment is now we're trying to boost the economy into investments into these areas and waiting for the right time, and you will see the diversification happening gradually in the UAE.
Ronaldo, just to pick up on this point, obviously, as an entrepreneur yourself, when you look around and think about this within the clean energy space, obviously, if you guys don't know, Abu Dhabi International Petroleum Exhibition in Congress is next week, otherwise known fondly as ADIPEC. It's a huge oil and gas conference. It takes place in Abu Dhabi, and it's a week long, and CNBC will be there. But it now is focusing in a very, very significant way, obviously, on clean energy. And these international oil and gas companies, all they want to talk about is to their shareholders how they're diversifying. But in a real sense, what opportunities do you see?
So I think for me, climate in this region is two, is one, the renewable energy, but also the water. When you go to countries like Egypt, Sudan, Syria, their main problem is water resources. And I have seen many entrepreneurs try to address that local problem, how to harvest water, save it, clean it. And you see a lot more investments and young guys going into those because, again, they're very local problems that may not persist in other parts of the world. So that's one area where I've mentored many companies who are trying to solve this issue, either being in better irrigation, better agriculture, but also in terms of cleaning the water and consuming it safely. So that's one area where it's related to probably the global warming, but in our region, we're seeing it in a different way, where we're actually seeing a lot of shortage of water, which creating all kinds of also social problems and some of the civil wars, I think, that we have in the region. So that's one area that I think we think of tech, but that's a whole different dimension to our, and obviously there's a lot that's going into, technology itself in terms of your renewable energy, but I see less of that here with the smaller startups. More the governments are playing a bigger role.
Any other questions?
So we've been discussing, and we've seen that the pandemic has changed things a lot. We've not mentioned the acceleration of the tech sector, the huge demand on tech. We all know there's a consumer shift, consumer buying patterns, with a lot of online. Now we all know there's a strain on the global supply chain. So my question is, now as we start meeting up, the emergence of COVID cases, pockets, across the world, are we ready for another wave? And is there, from a logistics point of view, is there a role that government can play to ease that strain, potentially protect consumers from repercussions like increased price of products and goods and things like that?
You guys could probably take that between you. Who's in the hot seat?
So at least I know what we're doing. I'm not, I mean, I'll let the government speak, but from our point of view, we looked at this as a technology problem. Again, we're a tech company at the end of the day. We do have a large supply chain component. And we basically started with improving our systems where we start how to forecast these products better and compensating to some of the scenarios that have taken place and what we have learned in terms of in case this happens, what type of products we need to be ordering more and less. And with that, we improved our forecast. We partnered with our vendors and sellers and selling partners to give them those forecasts so they're aware of what's coming down the road and how we're looking at things down the road. But then that's not enough. You have to go then using technology to improve your shipping lanes. We, for example, lease planes to fly some of the critical prioritized items. We invested massively in technology to do last mile delivery. So today in the UAE, 80 to 90% of the deliveries that take place are using our technology. So we were able to scale the supply chain using technology. The same applied to middle mile. So we really took a technological approach, to the data and making sure suppliers are aware of what we need and what our customers need in these situations, but then making sure all the way to the delivery of that package to the end customer, we factored in every part of the supply chain and scaled it using tech.
Well, before passing to government, let me talk about international organizations. I think you're raising a very important issue that has to do with the way global trade is going to be coming up out of this crisis. And there are a certain number of important lessons we see. Let me take an example from an adjacent region to here, which is Central Asia that I also cover. The priority today for a landlocked that in the past used to be, I would say, served by others and was used as a corridor from China to Europe is to become a platform whereby to be more serving the countries around and use the infrastructure that exists in order to create additional value add. A container that is shipped today from China to Europe by sea is equally costly now than being shipped by train, and train is faster. Therefore, this one of the disruptions that will lead gradually, I think, to a certain adaptation. What does it mean? It means that multilateralism matter and coordinated approach of addressing trade issues, financial issues is important. Using technology to accelerate and reduce the cost. This is where, for example, digital currency play an important role. And central bank digital currency is something that we are working on at the fund will play also an important role. Data-driven analysis and having not only private sector, but also government. We heard during this session more than 10 times the minister talking about data-driven decision-making. I think this is something that we also, as international organization, we could help by providing timely data, new type of analysis on those global trends for both private sector and public sector to act. Over to you.
I think you took all my answers, but I'll just keep it simple. I think the most important part when you look at the supply chain and the ripple effect that's created beyond COVID-19 is and doubling down on the multilateralism aspect of how do we look at the new multilateralism. We're going to go for the ministerial meeting that's happening in the WTO end of this month. And we're going to discuss about how do we take down the strain on the supply chain. And I think one vital approach is taking down red tape. And I think government need to really look into red tape and introducing more mobility into shipments that really moves between places to places. There's a lot of obstacles that comes into with red tape, with tax procedures, with a lot of things, and there is still that kind of set. From that aspect, I think it's important to look at red tape, reducing the cost on shipping, reducing the cost on moving with as well technology and digital aspect. I think we have a question in the back. Right? Yeah.
Just one quick comment. I think on the issue of data and getting the right information about things like the green economy or the gig economy, I spend a lot of my time designing data collection instruments in the labor survey kind of area. And currently our data is not very good to identify jobs in these new sectors. In fact, I was thinking the other day, how do you actually identify the gig economy within our usual classification of occupation and economic activity. And the same thing with the green economy. So I think we also need to think the way we collect information and design our data collection instruments.
You're on your own on this.
Well, I think you have raised an important question on how we can provide incentive to reforms to happen. I think necessity was the best accelerator of transformation. People needed technology and government reacted to that, allowing certain number of regulation to be changed and facilitating and expediting certain number of processes. I think now we have done it. Therefore, we need to keep doing it and not to return back to pre-COVID type of attitude. The second thing, I see certain number of institutions who could be leading in that. Central banks will play an important role with digital currency and improving digital platform. Here in the region, there is an initiative that is coordinated by the Arab Monetary Fund with several countries in it, including UAE, on digital and improving the whole digital connectivity when it comes to financial transactions. And this is something, for example, in this area, we have central banks playing a key role. There is another area where also we're seeing the government playing a key role is on the health sector. We were able to provide and get a lot of very good data on number of cases, on several dimensions of healthcare protection. And therefore, we need to keep doing this. The question is how to make this more effective. We need to elevate this to be one of the most important public goods in the region. And this is a struggle in the past because statistics data for those who work on the research was one of the weaknesses. I hope that one of the lessons of this crisis is to accelerate investment in statistics. Two, technology today is allowing us to multiply the capacity to use technology or to mobilize technology. Give you a small example. During the crisis, many of our institutions were using mobile phone transactions or number of messages sent in order to understand how economies are reacting, where people are. Therefore, I think there is one dimension that came up out of this crisis, that information is going to be key, and information management is also important. The issue here, and I will conclude with that, is not to create additional barriers, because the tendency is everyone wants to regulate and create a national market for that, where this cannot be controlled. And we need to make sure that, of course, data need to be protected, people need to be protected, but we allow data to circulate and to be used. This is the value of the future. Because we are in the region, this is the oil of the future. Therefore, it's very important to increase investing in that.
Thank you.